Wake up from the great Australian nightmare, and with friends like these, updates from our dangerous allies. Coming up on today's Citizens Report. Welcome to the Citizens Report for the 20th of February. I'm Elisa Barwick. Joining me today is Citizens Party researcher and writer Richard Bardon. Welcome, Richard.
Thanks, Elisa.
And on today's show, we're going to talk about the Great Australian Nightmare, which should have been the Great Australian Dream.
Used to be.
People owning a home, just one of the straightforward necessities of life. It has become a nightmare, and we're going to discuss the Australian Citizens Party's solutions in the format we've pulled together for the election campaign to lay out a solution that would 100% work and make a huge difference very rapidly. And then after that, we're going to talk about the latest from our Anglo-American allies. Who needs enemies, hey?
Yeah.
And that we're going to specifically update matters regarding to tariffs and trade, and also some news on AUKUS as well. Now, do subscribe to the show, hit the subscribe button and ring the notification bell if you are new to the show. And please comment below, hit the thumbs up icon. All those things help to get the show circulating, and you can also share it on social media. And if you like what we're saying in the show, and particularly some of the things we'll present today about what we're offering in terms of policy solutions during the elections, upcoming imminent elections, which may be called at any moment, there's also a donate button where you can donate to help our fantastic candidates advance the cause all over the country and potentially in your neck of the woods. So yes, do that, and we'll move into our first topic: wake up from the Great Australian Nightmare. Now, of course, Tuesday we heard from the illustrious Reserve Bank of Australia. Didn't exactly give us any wonderful solutions to the housing crisis. I mean, their rate cut, 0.25% rate cut, what difference will that make?
I mean, for a relative handful of marginal borrowers who have been pretty much cannibalising their budget to pay their mortgage, it'll make all the difference. To everybody else and to the country in the long term, no difference at all.
No, exactly. It's a little bit of reprieve to the continued slamming of Australian citizens and homes. So yeah, it's welcome, but it needs to be followed up, obviously, with much more serious action. So we're going to talk about two aspects of the solution. One which I want to cover first and run through a number of updates quite quickly, which is the post office bank solution, is to have a public bank that people can actually borrow from, and the other, for their mortgage or whatever. And the other aspect is the financial reorganisation that's necessary given the high level, completely overheated level of housing prices, which makes it completely impossible to afford a home. So we'll come back to that second aspect in a moment. But firstly, on the post office issue, there's been a lot of post office closures that are getting a lot of attention, and there's no two ways about it when we run through this coverage that has been drawn to this subject. We've got them surrounded. The banks, the politicians, they have to respond to these issues. And last week on the show, we covered the announcement from Treasurer Jim Chalmers that supposedly is going to save regional banks. Unfortunately, it's not the postal bank solution which has been put to him and which Labor has said is back on their agenda. But we have also found out, we've been informed that this proposal that he's put, which includes a moratorium on bank branch closures and reinforcing bank at post, or at least an in-principle agreement to restructure bank at post.
An agreement to have an agreement sometime.
Yeah, exactly. But we thought, well, is that his final word on, they're not going with the bank, this is all they're going to offer? Well, we have been told that it's not the final word, but time is running out, time is ticking. If they were going to go with a postal bank or do something serious, they'd want to do it pretty quick with the election coming up. So we'll keep pushing them. Essentially what they're doing here to this point is just doing something, curve fitting something that will try to keep the people pacified, but while keeping the banks happy.
Yeah,
that's never going to work.
A sort of a gecko tail.
Yeah.
There's no actual solution being proposed by the government, nor the opposition.
And we're
except, the real opposition.
Well, that's right. The duopoly is, they're always going to act within the constraints of what the banks will allow them to do. And we're going to talk about that when we come to the financial reorganisation part of this topic. But I wanted to mention, before we go there, someone who doesn't care a hoot about keeping the banks happy and who is going to really bring the heat to this campaign is our New South Wales top of the ticket Senate candidate, Professor Andy Schmulo, who has a background as a regulator, particularly financial regulation. His advice has been sought by governments all around the world. We'll put up his picture there. He spoke at our campaign launch last year, which I really recommend you go back and watch that show, which you'll see on our YouTube channel. Really excellent, because you'll see the quality of this guy to absolutely not hold back on bringing, all the real issues to the table on why the Australian banks are getting away with bloody murder, and the solutions in a really comprehensive way.
Yeah, as they say, he not only knows where all the bodies are buried, he probably knows who made the shovel.
Oh, absolutely. He leaves no stone unturned. And I just wanted to read his announcement of his candidacy from LinkedIn and other social media posts, because this will give you a flavour of what the guy's like. He says, "A big announcement I've been waiting to make. I'm pleased to announce today my candidacy for the Federal Senate for the great state of New South Wales as a candidate for the Australian Citizens Party. If elected, I promise to bring the same blowtorch tenderness and machine gun fire empathy, the same gentle and retiring nature that earned me the moniker spectacularly impolite from Miriam Robin in the Australian Financial Review, to my favourite collection of scumbag grifters, shysters, carpetbaggers, rent seekers and crooks. PwC Australia, KPMG Australia, the Australian Banking Association, Commonwealth Bank, Qantas, Woolworths Supermarkets and the others. If you want to see an end to the destruction of this country by crony, capitalist, grifters, tax evaders and crooks, send me your vote. If you want to see these crooks burned to the ground and then fire set to their ashes, tell everyone you know." Sounds like a man after your own heart, Richard. You sound like that when you talk about the banks. So this is excellent. And as I say, if you can support our campaign, this is what we're bringing to the table. But what Andy has raised here intersects, as I mentioned earlier, a whole spate of coverage regarding post office closures. And it's just such a hot topic because for so many communities, the post office is the only banking service they have left.
Well, all the big banks, especially the ANZ, which never signed, except I should say for the ANZ, which never signed up to the Bank at Post and is now being corralled into doing that, at least something that Chalmers might be useful for, if it happens. But they've all been telling everyone, no, you don't need a branch, just go to the post office. Just go to the post office. Just go to the post office. And now they've closed, 74 post offices in the last 12 months? 73, something like that.
Yeah, it's atrocious. But it's also in the city areas. And I want to play this clip from Channel 7 covering the closure of the Pennant Hills post office, which Andy makes a very brief appearance.
There's concern tonight among Northwest residents that Pennant Hills Post Office is about to shut its doors. It comes as Australia Post faces fresh scrutiny over its planned closure of post offices it says aren't sustainable.
A plan to turn an Australia Post office into a Korean barbecue restaurant. The development application in Sydney's Pennant Hills has locals worried.
A lot of people very upset about it, I think.
You go in there now and there's a queue of half a dozen people.
Maybe going the same way as local bank branches.
The last bank closed and said you can come and get your cash from the post office. So how are we going to get cash now?
Australia Post says it's talking to the building's owner. The Hornsby Council is seeking assurances from postal authorities this busy area won't lose an essential service.
At this point in time, they haven't confirmed what that commitment, if any, is going to be. So we are very concerned.
Australia Post already under pressure over its decision to close the doors of shop fronts. Critics say 73 shut down nationally in the last year.
They have an obligation to the community to keep post offices open.
Australia Post has made it clear before now that branch closures are necessary for it to remain viable as it concentrates on parts of its business that are booming. Like the lucrative parcel market. Australia Post says with online transactions and falling customer visits, some stores can't survive.
There's an expectation with Australia Post, of course, that goes beyond simply profitability.
Chris Marr, 7 News.
Now, also the same day as that, Angela Cramp, the head of the Licensed Post Office Group, also made radio appearances on 2GB in Sydney and 5AA in Adelaide on this same issue. The issue was raised on Macca's Australia All Over this past Sunday, where they were talking about, cash and postal services and some of the areas where post offices are lacking in being able to service the regional and rural communities. And
because the banks won't let them.
Exactly.
Because they get to set the terms for the deal.
And they're not full service banks, of course. And so Scott Etherington, also from the Licensed Post Office Group, he was tipped off and he called in. And Macca talked back and forth with him for about 12 minutes about the solutions, and he was able to explain the limitations, as you said, on post offices and what the difference would be if Australia Post were to actually be a bank in its own right and not just function as the counter for the other major banks. Huge difference. So this was a really excellent presentation, and again, airing these ideas and promoting the idea of a post office bank. Now, add to that, the other major closure that we've been intervening on is the Maroochydore Sunshine Coast, one of the bank branches there, post offices there, that is closing. And we had our ACP people, led by our State Secretary and Senate candidate for Queensland, Jan Pacallis, made an excellent intervention with a rally that took place a couple of days ago. And look at this excellent coverage that appeared on 7 News Sunshine Coast.
Well, locals have rallied in a last-ditch bid to stop the Maroochydore Post Office from closing. Protesters say Australia Post has a network that big business just can't match, which should be used, not reduced, and everything must be done to save them.
Taking to the streets to deliver a message straight to the door of Australia Post. In just over 2 weeks, this Maroochydore Post Office will close for good after Australia Post was evicted.
A lot of local people hate the fact that they're losing their post office. Are we going to wait till it's the last post office before we fight?
Australia Post told 7 News as customer visits continue to decline, we have made the decision to close some post offices in city centres where there is a clear oversupply.
It's hard enough to get around our streets as it is today. Hard enough to expect people to go to busy shopping centres to try and find a car park.
Currently we have under the regulations the requirement to maintain 4,000 post offices, 2,500 of those in regional and rural Australia, which we obviously fulfil.
Right now there are almost 4,200 post offices, including more than 2,500 in rural and remote areas.
They have the biggest retail footprint in Australia, more than Coles and Woolies combined, more than all the banks combined.
The Australian Citizens Party thinks the solution is using that network to establish a government-owned post office bank and break the monopoly of the Big Four. Connor Alforque, 7 News.
So that just goes to show, even the major TV channels, albeit in the local regional areas, because of course, the major stations now don't, even have local reporters, they just cover nationwide or statewide. But the locals are really concerned about these issues. And I'll just add as well that the senior newspaper had an excellent feature, and we'll put it up on the screen. Could post office banks reduce Australia Post closures and help elderly locals? And they cited Chris Grease, Chief Executive of National Seniors Australia, who said that his organisation, quote, supported the concept of post offices getting a banking licence. He said the closure of a post office and the local bank could often spell the demise of a community, and that Bank at Post meant that post offices currently were only a handling service for the banks, and people deserve more. So this is a really important issue, and the locals and people are going to fight for it. Another one of our candidates who's intervened on this issue is Councillor Richard Foley from Wagga, and he's our candidate for the House of Representatives New South Wales seat of Riverina, and he has been fighting on the issue of restoring banking services to that region for many, many years. He's advocated at some of the local government association meetings and at his local council and passed motions and so forth. He's tirelessly fought for this, and he took umbrage when National Party MP for that area and former Deputy Prime Minister Michael McCormack put out a post after Jim Chalmers' announcement of, we're getting this moratoria on bank closures in the regions. He tried to take credit for it.
Yeah, just insinuating without quite openly saying so that he was, helping drive this.
Yeah.
McCormack, or McDormat as I call him, because that's all he really is. Like far too many of his colleagues, though not all.
Yep. And so you can read Richard Foley put out a statement on Facebook, our candidate, about this, in which he laid out what he's done as opposed to the nothing that McCormack's done, and what the Citizen Party solution is. And as he said, the banking cartel fears this movement. They fear a strong independent voice in Parliament who isn't on their leash.
Yep. And just because, should mention, the other two gentlemen in that photo with McCormack did excellent work on that banking inquiry. McCormack never even turned up.
And that's why he put that photo with them, because by association he's hoping he'll get some credit. Hopeless.
Hoping it rubs off on him.
So now, I just wanted to briefly mention too that all of this is also happening against the backdrop of a huge ferment on saving cash, which drove the government to put forward a consultation on mandating cash acceptance. And in our Australian Alert Service this week, you can read what we submitted to the consultation on that, which was due last Friday. And thank you for all of those activists out there who also put in their own submissions, some of whom people have sent them through to us, which are excellent. So you can read what we had to say. And there was also coverage that came out in news.com.au. 200,000 Australian cash advocates push for new reforms, and that's just stating that there's now 200,000 names on the petition to save cash. So the support for that is very strong in the background to this whole shift that's taking place. Now we want to talk about housing though, and why no family will lose their home under the ACP housing policy. And just to situate it, let's put up, there was an article that came out, Australia is the land of the mega mortgage. This is an article by Leith Van Onselen for Macro Business, and he says we have among the most indebted households in the world, which you can see in this graph here, household debt to income. So you see Australia at the top there. Yeah,
and rent is almost as bad and on a worse trajectory. And flattened out in Melbourne recently, but otherwise, yeah.
And we're going to come to how we can bring rents down even more, and mortgage interest payments. But also this graph, which shows the proportion of income needed to meet mortgage payments. So, just look at that curve and how it has soared in this recent period since around 2021. I mean, this, you can't expect people to live like this, putting more than 50% of their income into their mortgage. And probably many of them will never pay it off by the time that they retire, certainly people that are getting a new mortgage at the moment. So we put out an article about this in last week's Australian Alert Service, which sums up our policy. It was headlined, "Why the Banks Won't Let the Government Solve the Housing Crisis and What You Can Do About It." So, as we said in that article, there are many actions the governments could take to reduce the heat in the housing bubble, and we cited the comments of Claire O'Neill, who had said late last
the
year,
housing minister, yeah.
that we do not want to see housing prices actually come down. We want to see them.
That is the federal government. Yeah, they want them to keep growing, just sustainably, whatever that means.
Exactly. So there are many actions they could take. Why won't they do it? As we said in the article, the answer is the banks won't let them. And the banks, of course, are major funders of the major political parties. They lobby them. Often they actually design their policies. And they do that in conjunction with the big four auditing firms, big corporations, the mass media at their back, that whole protection racket. And I mean, the short answer to this, of why the banks won't let them do it, is the banks obviously have trillions of dollars tied up in the property bubble, and they can't afford to see the bubble burst. So that if the governments were to increase supply of housing by any significant amount and prices begin to, start deflating, what would happen to the banks when they've got 70% of their loan books in mortgages or thereabouts, approaching that number? And the value of those houses are the collateral for their mortgage loans, which can fall below the outstanding debt on their books. These are the big issues when they've just poured the money in, poured the lending in a lot of periods in recent history, not much documentation to take those loans. Because when prices are going up, they're happy to lend you, little old you who doesn't exactly have a windfall in your bank account and a huge income. They don't really care, because as long as the price of the house keeps going up, they can sell it again and recoup.
Yeah, even if they foreclose on you. But it's not just that. Remember our friend Denise Brayley, who was the head of the Banking and Finance Consumer Support Association. She's a trained criminologist and all that. And she exposed many years ago how the banks themselves were faking. It wasn't liar loans like people say. I mean, there are some of those, but there always are. The banks were the liars. They were faking people's income figures in their own computers, and she proved that.
Yeah, no, this is atrocious. The government is in a position where it feels it has to protect bank profits. If the market came down and the heat came out of the bubble, suddenly those bank profits are going to, probably implode at a certain point. But most of the bank profits, as you and Robbie talked about on a previous show, go overseas.
Yeah, well, I mean, anything that goes off as dividend, the profits that get divvied out to the shareholders, well, in the case of the major banks, around 80% or up to 80% of those banks, the shares are held by foreign interests, and most of those foreign interests are American, led by BlackRock, Vanguard and State Street, the big three private investment management firms.
Yeah, so we need people in government that have the guts to not care what happens to these big players that you just named and do it anyway. And in 2004, as we've said before on the show, the Productivity Commission was commissioned to do a review after the Costello tax breaks for investors, and they actually said, look, this is inflated and blown up the housing market. People can't afford a home. You should trash this, or effectively something to that effect.
Treasury gave similar advice that Howard buried.
Yeah.
But just a point, because you talk about it is a bubble, and as I like to say, it's a fact of finance and physics. All bubbles always burst eventually. Yeah. So the banks are their own worst enemy in this, in the long run, because at some point you run out of you can only keep the plates all spinning for so long before they crash down to the stage. Yeah. And then there's no more show.
Well, the government refused to take the advice of those reviews in 2004 that they commissioned themselves. They wouldn't do it, they weren't game then. And if they weren't game then, they're certainly not game now, because look at everything that's been piled on top since then. It's going to be a much bigger problem than had they taken action then. So let's look at the solutions, because we've documented and we've discussed this at length on the show in the past, that Australia had government programs to build affordable housing that worked brilliantly in the past. We had state government programs. So, for instance, and just to give the bottom line of it, the Victorian State Banking Program to build homes in 1 year in 1922 to 23 built 5,000 homes And the equivalent today, if you adjust for population and so forth, would be 80,000 homes nationwide in 1 year. So the kinds of figures that are being discussed, like for instance, one of Albanese's figures was 30,000 homes. Well, let's put up this image from the Courier Mail on the 8th December 1943. You know, this was 1943, and they were talking about building 30,000 homes in the wake of a world war, which half of our young men were not home yet, many had been killed and so forth.
Came back with limbs missing, all the rest of it.
And we had a massive shortage of everything to build or construct anything because it had all been used up in the war effort. And so we had to start from scratch a lot of new industries, you know, from brick building to, you know, everything that was required. And yet the Commonwealth State Housing Agreement that was launched by Curtin and Chifley at the end of the war built 100,000 homes in a decade under those conditions.
And, you know, just a footnote, because we quoted macro business before, they're always banging on about you've got to curb immigration, right, demand side stuff. That's relevant in the short term because our governments over the last 40 years, Labor and Liberal, have deliberately destroyed and offshored all our productive industries.
Yeah.
You do need time to get those steel, you know, various manufacturing, but especially steel and other building materials. But the post-World War II immigration program proportionally was much bigger than anything, even this big burst of immigration we've had in the last couple of years under Labor that everybody's going on about. So that's not the issue as such. When those migrants, new Australians, were brought in, they were put straight to work building the town they were going to live in, the infrastructure to support it, the road to get there.
Yeah.
You know, so
those kind of problems are
these are political problems.
And they're problems that, in a sense, are good to have, because if you've got those problems, if you've got those things that are lacking, it gives you a job to do. And in the course of building that infrastructure and doing all that work, you're building a country, you're putting people to work, you're paying them, you're generating revenue and so forth.
And so whilst you would need to temporarily crimp the immigration rates until you catch up on your productive side, we have more work needs doing in this country than we have people to do it by a very long stride. So
now, further to the solutions, I want to lay out this program because referring to another one of our candidates, excellent candidate in the seat of Corwell, just to the north of Melbourne here, Basima Hawley. She's living in an electorate, this postcode 3064, according to Martin North's Digital Finance Analytics research, where 44.2% of households with mortgages are mortgage stressed. It's got the highest percentage of households in Victoria that have fallen behind on payments, with nearly 3% in arrears and at risk of foreclosure. So we laid out a program, and Basima is doing a weekly discussion about such matters on her Facebook page every Wednesday at 7 p.m. So we laid this out. I just want to run through it quickly to give people a sense of our full program. So it comes in two sections: emergency solutions and long-term solutions. On the emergency front, one, stop foreclosures, which includes the government declaring a moratorium or a ban on banks foreclosing on family homes. That would cover only your residence, not investment properties, of course. And the bank will not be able to kick you out of your home and sell your home. Now, that brings in a second point, writing down the debt. The Australian Citizens Party would direct the Reserve Bank to work with the banks to write down the outstanding debt on loans the banks wish to foreclose in order to reduce mortgage payments to affordable levels.
And there's various means to do it that have been done here and in other places, but the gist of it is you're taking the Reserve Bank of Australia is government owned, not like the US Federal Reserve. And so it is the government's bank. It could have been solving these problems, as we've been talking about, instead of just smashing people with interest rates. So the idea is, effectively, it would buy out, refinance the mortgages.
Take them onto its
books, and then whether you set up a special vehicle like like Franklin Roosevelt's New Deal groups. You don't need to do that here like he did there for the ownership reason, but there might be other reasons. But the basic idea is that the banks are taking a haircut on those loans because they are the ones who deliberately wrote unsustainable loans.
Yeah.
But they're not losing the lot. They're not being nationalised. They're not. Now, some people might argue that were a good thing, Ben Chifley, for example. But that's not what we're talking about here.
No.
Things aren't at that stage yet. If you let it collapse first, well, then, then that's the kind of thing you have to talk about.
Exactly.
Which is why I said the banks are their own worst enemy in the long run.
Yeah. Which brings me to the long-term solutions. So number one, public housing. So we're talking about a government-owned public bank to invest in a big public housing program. That was the way it was done in the post-World War II period that we described. The Commonwealth Bank gave the funds to agencies in the states to conduct and build and supervise public housing, either for people to purchase or to rent. So we can do that again. Secondly, this will reduce demand for private housing stock and help put a brake on house prices. Then we have loans to first home buyers. So such a public bank can also provide affordable loans to first home buyers at lower interest rates than the private banks. And finally, reforming the tax system to remove home buyers' disadvantage. Namely changing the tax rules to remove the advantage that investors currently have, which goes back to that 2004.
Capital gains tax discount primarily and some other things.
Yeah, exactly. So, and by the way, you can read more about this on the back page of this week's Australian Alert Service. We have done all of this before, and that article I wrote just looks at the 1930 to 31 period after the crash of 29. The Great Depression was at its peak, crushing people. All states introduced four things, or one or more of these four things: mortgage interest rate reduction acts, moratorium legislation in all states that prevented foreclosures, rent reduction acts, which brought rents down by up to 20% within 2 years, and farmer relief acts were passed in all the major wheat growing states, which put stay orders on foreclosures and things, siloing certain debts of the farmers that were frozen without accruing interest until they could get back on their feet, and fostering the financial protection and rehabilitation of those producers.
Which again is something that a government-owned bank with as Dennis and Miller said, the whole capital of the nation behind it, can afford to do that in a way that private banks never can. No matter how the health of their books or otherwise. They simply can't do what a public bank can.
That's right. So join our campaign for the public bank because, and to save Australia Post by creating a bank, that is the pathway to solving this problem and people, having the chance to fulfil the great Australian dream, get out of this nightmare. All right, so we've spent a lot of time on that, but we'll briefly now get to our next topic with friends like these, updates from our dangerous allies. So we've got a couple of reports to fill people in on just because, one of our main campaign policies, one of our main flanks to shift this country is an independent foreign policy. We have to be making our own decision, making sovereign decisions, whether it be on finance or foreign policy. And so there's two matters. One is the tariff announcements made by Trump this week, and then we'll come to AUKUS. But Richard, you wrote up an article for this week's Australian Alert Service on Trump's tariff threat. He basically stated that he would make 25% tariffs across the board without exemptions. But will Australia get an exemption? What's your assessment of it?
This is tariffs on steel and aluminium because America these days imports nearly all of its aluminium and a lot of its steel. So Trump signed this executive order that's supposed to take effect early next month. Nobody seems quite sure of the date and whether we've got an extension on that. Yeah. But anyway, sometime early next month. And so, of course, the Australian Trade Department is doing their job and pulling together the case for why we are not an issue the way that Trump's trade advisor, Peter Navarro, is saying, because this guy, who is an absolute nut, he got on TV and claimed that Australia's aluminium producing companies are majority owned by China and deliberately flooding the American market to destroy they're killing us to destroy what's left of the United States aluminium processing, which they offshored, like we offshored most of our industries in Australia. Same neoliberal nonsense starting about 40 years ago. So a bit longer. But none of this is true. We're not flooding the market. Australia's supply, it went up recently because the Americans asked us to sell them more because they put punitive tariffs on Russian aluminium and needed to get more from their other suppliers to fill the gap because of the war in Ukraine and all that business. So the Americans asked us for more aluminiums, which we were happy, raw aluminium, primary aluminium, which we were happy to furnish them. The two aluminium producing companies in Australia, Alcoa and Rio Tinto, are both majority American owned. Alcoa is the aluminum company of America. That's what the name is short for. It's based in Pittsburgh, Pennsylvania. And Rio Tinto, of course, is the British-Australian dual-listed company. There's a Chinese state-owned company that owns a small minority of it. I think it's 10 or 11% currently. Conflicting reports. You have to wait for the disclosures, annual disclosures in the reports. But anyway, it's apparently around 11% at the moment. 65 or so % of it, varying year by year, but is consistently held by American interests, again led by BlackRock Group, BlackRock Inc. And so this is a complete lie.
Yeah, it's not China then.
It's not China, and it's not flooding the market. We're 2% of American aluminium imports.
Yeah.
1/30th of what they import from Canada.
Yep.
And this guy making up nonsense about China is nothing new. Nobody should ever take anything that comes out of this guy's mouth, certainly about China, probably about anything, seriously.
Yeah, you can read the details in the article.
I mean, this is the guy who made up a source for what was going on in China and what the evil, nefarious Chinese Communist Party, as they like to call it, is up to.
Yeah.
He made it up. It's an anagram of his own name. This source doesn't exist, despite being cited in 6 of his books. And this came out 5-6 years ago. So why does anyone take this guy seriously?
Now, they're also, however, raising another matter, which is unfair trade barriers.
And this is the big...
Yeah.
Because they're using this fake claim of and dangling this exemption from metals tariffs to try to pry open Australia's food market, agricultural products, primary products, and thereby destroy our market access to Asia and a lot of other countries because of all the diseases and pests that we don't have. Yeah. But we would be at risk, the clean, green Australia and New Zealand, cleanest, safest food products in the world. That's our whole MO.
So the Office of the US Trade Representative has complained about our strict biosecurity rules blockading or blocking the sale of US beef, pork, poultry, apples and pears.
Yeah. We dropped the boom, Howard did in 2003, because mad cow disease became established in North America. We can't afford to have that here. No more beef exports anywhere ever.
And who would want to let that in?
No fresh beef anyway, which is our major thing, despite Labor's efforts to shut down live export and so on. Pork, basically any virus you can think of, including foot and mouth disease, various swine flus. The original swine flu, by the way, started in North America. It's not Spanish. The 1918 pandemic. African swine fever is in America now. All of these things. So you don't want that here. And if fresh pork, you can't get those viruses stay live and viable in pork and poultry in a way that they don't in a lot of other products, hence the bans, and that's the fresh pork ban is universal. It's not unfair discriminatory trade practice against America. We import a whole lot of, the majority of ham and bacon, cured pork, that doesn't have the negligible, it has a negligible risk of any kind of that contamination. We import a heap of that. A lot of it from America, but not fresh from anywhere. And the same thing with most fruits and vegetables from most countries. Apples and pears specific to the US is because there are pests there that, again, we can't afford to have here. And so, and talking about China, I just saw a figure this morning, which I didn't find to put in the article, and it was cited in the papers this morning, saying over 1/3, almost 35% of our fruit and vegetable exports go to China. 80% go to Asia. Most of those markets, all of them, to some extent, have very strict restrictions on countries that don't that have these various diseases and pests in them because they don't want them, which is why they buy them from us. So if any government here were to let the Americans in, we suddenly lose a good deal of, and if those diseases actually get here, all of access to most of those markets.
And not to mention how it would affect us ourselves.
Yeah, I mean, they kicked and screamed and cried, yelled bloody murder about Chinese temporarily stopping imports of beef from Chinese-owned abattoirs in Australia because of labelling issues, because of their quality assurance things. Imagine what happens if we allow the Americans to strong-arm us into this.
But fortunately, as you wrote, it's unlikely that our political leaders are going to let that happen.
They're not. I mean, it would be, as I said in the article, electoral suicide for the National Party. They would never get another vote again, except for maybe a few corporate ag guys who don't care. But and so the coalition is not going to do that. I can't see that happening, and then therefore Labor is very unlikely to do it, although I never underestimate the spinelessness of Anthony Albanese based on recent experience.
Do we import jellyfish? What diseases do they have? Anyway, just as a segue to talk about AUKUS, I thought it's worth quoting university historian Professor James Curran, who said on this matter, he said, look, we've basically given the country to the US warfighting machine without any real public acknowledgement of what that might mean for Australia's sovereignty and freedom of movement. But that's seemingly not enough for the trade hardheads in the White House to leave us alone on tariffs. So, fair point. Now, on AUKUS though, because this is the matrix under which we have, given our country to the US for whatever purpose they wish, and don't ever forget that famous Pentagon map that divided it up into the regions, that they would use Australia for, the production of the materials and for the force posture, projection, and etc. It's just really, really blatant what how they view Australia.
Take over the entire manufacturing, rebuild it to their needs to the extent that they need it. And we're all worker ants.
Purposes.
We're all worker ants for their
exactly.
Their war.
But that AUKUS matrix under which that's happening ain't going to happen anyway. I mean, we've said it 100 times, but now it's being officially recognised to a major degree with news that has just broken that Rolls-Royce in the UK basically can't produce the reactor cores that will drive the AUKUS subs.
Yeah, so the idea is that first we're going to buy some Virginia-class American boats, except they can't make enough for their own navy. So and there's an escape clause where they don't have to sell them to us, which they won't. We're already paying for them.
Yeah.
Miles just went over there and gave them almost $1 billion.
Yeah.
5 months early just to suck up.
Yeah.
And grinned about it like he does.
And as the point was made in our article, if he hadn't have given that $800 million to them 5 months early, he could have stuck it in the Commonwealth Bank in just a regular account and earned $17 million interest over those next 5 months. What is wrong with us?
And so we're doing that. We just poured, I think it's almost $5 billion that we've agreed to and signed the contract for and already putting into the Rolls-Royce, the British nuclear sub operations, because theirs is even more lackadaisical than the Americans, and that's saying something. Basically, the British can't keep a submarine seaworthy or build any more new ones. And they're supposed to supply these reactors with American technology that is licensed to them, submarine reactor technology.
Mm-hmm.
They're supposed to supply them to us for our imaginary future submarines that are never going to get built.
Yeah.
And now they're saying themselves, the British government, we cannot, well, you've probably got the wording right there.
The UK government's Infrastructure and Projects Authority has labelled the program to deliver these reactors on time as, quote, having major issues that do not appear to be manageable or resolvable. And the report went on to warn, successful delivery of the AUKUS projects appears to be unachievable.
And that's a direct quote.
Exactly. So, you know.
Unachievable. But hey, we already signed the force posture agreement, and we already signed the agreement. It's not passed quite yet, but there's this treaty to hand over control of our military capability to the Americans and our industry and our resource base, rare earth metals, lithium, all the rest of it that we've been reporting on this show. So they've got what I mean, talk about a cheap shout.
Mm. Oh, yeah. So we need leaders who are willing to just say, and this is, again, where our candidates come in. We're courageous enough to say, scrap it now. I mean, we had leaders who were willing to scrap the French program, but would they be willing to do it to our dangerous Anglo-American allies, in the words of Malcolm Fraser, former Prime Minister?
I'm thinking of a quote from Ben Chifley about the intelligence establishment that they were setting up the Five Eyes post-war, and they wouldn't tell him what was going on and wanted him to just follow orders. And he wrote in a cable to the ambassador in the United States. He says, "Tell them they may go to Hades and let us know the date of their going."
Well said, well said. So yeah, we need leaders like that today. So support us in any way you can. Support your local candidate. Give us a call on our toll-free number and we can put you in touch with the campaigns in your local area. If you want to find out more first, contact us for a complimentary copy of the Australian Alert Service. If you haven't seen it, we'll send you one out. You can subscribe if you've seen it before as another way of supporting what we're doing here. We need to break these ideas out, using this campaign as a vehicle to do so. And, everything on the postal bank that we showed at the start of the show shows what is possible. It's reaching, gripping the minds of everybody across the country. So, you're not going to get a bad reception when you raise these matters to people out on the street. So we've got to do as much of that as we can in the lead up to this election, whenever it may be. So we might have more to tell you about that by next week's show. But that's it for this week. Thanks, Richard.
Thanks, Elisa.
And see you again next week.
Authorised by Robert Barwick, Citizens Party, Melbourne.